Here at Kathy, he lives on Craigie Street. He's the DFC candidate. His friends all live in New Jersey.
Greetings all, welcome, it's nice to have you here. Pleasure to have you as well. Business ends of things, if you missed the bucket on the way in, please try to contribute if you can. All that money goes to the readers and it pays them for working, which they are doing. If you want to be on mailing lists, reading lists, or anything like that, talk to me at the end of things, and we'll make the arrangements for that. Coming up on January 10th is probably the most important thing that's upcoming. Is going to be a celebration of some kind. It's still, the Watkins are putting this together. You may remember Ben Watkins' photographs that were up here last year, old friend of Bill Corbett's, and they are putting together a celebration of Bill at Grafton Street. It's going to start at, what, 4 o'clock? You got a sign. There we go. 4 o'clock in the afternoon and go on until they throw us out, which will probably be around 7 or so. Food, drink, anything else I'm leaving off?
No,
remembering.
I think Fred Moulton is going to show.
Is that going to happen?
I think so.
Oh, I hope it does.
But he'll do the talk he gave at the MFA about Bill.
Yeah.
He'll do that.
Which, if you missed that talk, it was one of the most breathtaking evenings I've had. It was a very, very long time. It was like, I kept saying, it was like sitting and listening to Emerson. You know, talk and assess things from, were you there? Because, and we had no idea, I didn't know what to expect. He gave a talk on Stettheimer, Ives, hi there, greetings. Hi. Stettheimer, Ives, and Corbett, and without, any indication of where he was going to go with it, and it was the most delightful celebration of not only them, but Bill. It couldn't have been any better for accounting for Bill Corbett and the imprint that he left on so many of us. So that's on the 10th, and everybody is apparently welcome to drop into that and go from there. Upcoming here, we'll be back. We're going to take the winter and let it be winter, and so it's not. We're not digging our way in out here. It gets a little tedious. So most likely the next thing up will be in March, and we've got John High and Christopher Soro-Lusano coming in, and Simon Pettit's coming in. Photographs by a friend of his will be up on the walls. And then if I can, it'll be interesting to see. I'm still attempting to see what can be pulled together to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the death of Mr. Robert Duncan, which will be in April. And I'm looking for, if you have projects, papers, anything like that. I have not been deluged. Mr. Wellman has happily given me, indication as Miss Lepson is sitting up here, and we'll see what we end up with. I've kind of marked off an entire weekend if there's enough. If there's not, we'll do one day. We're going to read from the letters between himself and Ms. Levertoff, which are an interesting group of letters. The book is that thick. I promise it won't be that whole thing. And that's coming up in April. So that's the future, and we'll see what else pops up in between now and then. Isabel's working on some perhaps a pop-up show of Brazilian musicians that want to come out here and do something. And
bass player.
Yeah, I'll tell you, one of the best bass players I've ever heard. We sort of went off and it was Friends, and we went to see them, and my God, the ensemble that they had, and then they ended up, they did a thing at Tufts when their CD was going to be issued, and then it ended up, it was Regatta Bar that we went to see them, right? And I don't know what they would do. We've got to sit down and figure out where they're going to put everything, how they're going to play, what's going to go on, and then we got to get all in Brazilians that are going to be wanting to dance or whatever and get their shoes off. So
the album is called Engineers because it's the engineers of words, because they picked some writers to put music on to.
Yeah, and so it's mixed with some of the poetry was in English this last time, but most of it's in Portuguese. But it was just delightful, and the musicianship was stunning. Just absolutely stunning. So that's another possibility. So to formally start in, the first thing I want to do before we get to Ms. Howe is to re-acknowledge we're surrounded by Thorpe Feidt. Thorpe is an old and dear friend. It goes back as far as when I first poked my head out around here. Thorpe's came to Boston, came to Gloucester, looking for Olson. When he was in his younger days, and I think they were making a film, and they were going to try to film Olson, and he ended up staying. He is a painter, he is a writer, his book, which you should look at, is sitting up here, The Oracular Room. is to my mind a great achievement of a book. It's it's sort of akin to Vonnegut in some ways, but much more philosophical, and the writing is beautiful. And then he makes these paintings, and these paintings are part of this whole ensemble called The Ambiguities that he worked on for over 30 years. There was, Don, you don't know how many of them there were supposed to be, do you? Was it? It was in the hundreds, I mean, and this was projected. And so when I first knew Thorpe, he was up to like number 200 and whatever,
Wow.
and still going. And these you'll see they have numbers on them, so you can see where they got. But he's one of those just wonderful, gentle presences that is so knowledgeable and just working. Isabel and I spent this delightful day in his home up in Ipswich picking these out. Although he had paintings everywhere, and every time we would go, oh, we got to have that one, he'd go, I don't want to let that one out of the house. And he'd say, you can have this one though, and the whole afternoon kind of went that way. We were always directed towards other things. So it's been a delight to have his work up here.
And don't forget, this is a gift.
Yeah, he gave them to the series and to us, and and so it was because he was supposed to come and read, and then he decided he didn't want to go out of the house anymore, and especially to come down here to the Wicked City, and so he said, "But I will give you all those paintings if that's okay." I'm like, okay.
Wow.
So so we'll be able to put them up from time to time and share them back out with different things that he's doing. And that brings me to you. Trouble making Miss Howe. I've been since I don't write my introductions down. I usually spend Saturdays and Sundays, and for this has been a month since I last had the pleasure of introducing both of you. This is Ruth Lepson, if you happen not to know. And I got to introduce both of them at the Pioneer Valley Poetry Festival out in Amherst back in October, right?
Yeah.
It's back there in October. And so been there, done that, and so I've been racking my brain. How can I place Miss Howe in and you too? Because actually, let me back up. When the series first started, I was desperately trying to figure out, and I had notebooks full of who's going to read when and how am I going to do this, and the first sets of notebooks. Of course, all the plans fell apart because people weren't there. This wasn't happening that way, and it was like just this chaos. And finally, through that, what formed up was that the first reading was going to be Bill Corbett and Garrett Lansing, and I wanted to found everything on the two of them because both of them had been just so important to me and to everybody that I was aware of that was working in the area. And then Ed Barrett, Ms. Zimmerman here, who was one of the roots back into the old series, both her and Ed. We're up, I believe, next. Yeah, was it second? I think it was. Now that I think of it. And then I was looking at what to do with Ruth, and I landed on what to do. Well, she's a problem. But what I landed on is the last reading of that sequence was going to be. I think that one was dead on Emily Dickinson's birthday. And I said, so we should celebrate, just poetry. We're not reading Emily Dickinson. You can do that for yourselves. But I wanted to somehow mark it, and the way I marked that was to say I want to concentrate on one person who's generally, the idea is from this area, but I don't have any rules, but that's the idea. And to let their work spread out in front of us a little bit to give them the afternoon. And Ruth was the first one, and that reading still resonates in my mind as being one of the little organizing jewels. I get to sit down and listen, right, once we're done here, and then take the energy that I find there and plow on. So last year was Carol Weston, and this year is Miss Howe. And I remember, especially once word of mouth got going, one of the things I kept saying repeatedly is, well, there's this whole crew of people who had this great romance about Gertrude Stein and what it must have been like to be out in that room at that table, and to be able to go out to the atelier on Saturday nights, and Picasso and Hemingway. And the thing I realized very early on is that most of them wouldn't have been there because they wouldn't have known anybody that was there. And it's one thing if you said Picasso was going to be across the street right now, we would all leave you, no offense, and go hang. But when it's just that weird guy that comes in with his really weird girlfriend and they're always late, and so on and so forth, it starts to get a little more tedious. And what happens is, and the reason I'm bringing this all up, is that a lot of these people have such a romantic idea of that salon and any other salon you might want to bring up, that they actually, miss what is going on around them. And that's always been my interest, is trying to figure out what's going on around us. When I was trying to rummage what to say about Fanny this morning, I kept remembering that one of the things that Robert Duncan did at readings, which I thought was what you did, because I was in my 20s, and I didn't realize until later, no, nobody does that. It was him and a couple, maybe Bob Creeley. But he would, look around the audience, and he would be recognizing, Don Wellman is here, Steve and Leanne are here, who are artists, David is here, on and on and on, and say something about how lovely it was to have them acknowledge that he was reading in front of them. And for me, who was 22 years old, I'm looking over going, well, who's this Oppen guy, and literally, and realizing that there was this community flowing around me. And I bring all this up because the one thing I return to over and over and over again is, for me, for my life, to have you here amongst us, and to be able to, for now, dear God, Fanny, 30 years, that this has been going on since, and it was, again, all things go back to Bill in a lovely way, because Bill was the first person to suggest to me that I might want to know who Fanny Howe was. And I bought Robeson Street at the Grolier for cash, and and sat there reading it going, wow. And then Bill said she would be willing to read for you, I think, let me ask her. And off we went from there. And it has been just this treasure trove of energy moving out ahead of me, always ahead of me, because what you do in your work, and what I was trying to say out in Amherst, which is there is this constant feeling for me of somebody who is searching quietly, no dramas, no big, hands raised in the air, running about, just doing the work, and doing the work in that deep way that I am sometimes capable of, she seems always capable of. The last two books, I keep saying, are absolute jewels. They're masterpieces, if that word is applicable to, be kicked around, that has charged my poetic life in a way that I can't even begin to start to address here, but down to my center. And so to have you here, this is not the first time she read for word of mouth. She's read here before, and it's just her participation in our community is a great, great treasure. And to have her here for the afternoon is a wonderful thing. Please welcome Fanny Howe.
Thank you for making this heavenly little space available to us. I brought books of my own to give away free if anyone wants them. It's come to that. If some of you know the expression, someone is a friend of Bill, does anybody? You're all so good, you don't know. Anyway, do come to that, and that's definitely going to happen. Ruth is going to read some of the poems from this book that I translated with Polish help, because I simply can't read these poems. I can't get through it. So it's just great to have Ruth as the perfect, gentle reader to put them out in the air. But first, I'm going to read something else. At last, after many postponements, on August 16th, 1870, I found myself face to face with my hitherto unseen correspondent. It was at her father's house, one of those large square brick mansions so familiar in our older New England towns, surrounded by trees and blossoming shrubs without, and within exquisitely neat, cool, spacious, and fragrant with flowers. After a little delay, I heard an extremely faint and pattering footstep, like that of a child in the hall, and in glided, almost noiselessly, a plain, shy little person, the face without a single good feature, but with eyes, as she herself said, like sherry, the guest leaves in the glass. And with smooth bands of reddish chestnut hair, she had a quaint and nun-like look, as if she might be a German canoness of some religious order, whose prescribed garb was white pique with a blue net worsted shawl. She came towards me with 2 daylilies, which she put in a childlike fashion into my hand, saying softly under her breath, "These are my introduction," and adding also under her breath, in childlike fashion, "Forgive me if I'm frightened. I never see strangers and hardly know what I say." But soon she began to talk, and thenceforth continued almost constantly, pausing sometimes to beg that I would talk instead, but readily recommencing when I evaded. There was not a trace of affectation in all this. She seemed to speak absolutely for her own relief, and wholly without watching its effect on her hearer. Led on by me, she told me much about her early life, in which her father was always the chief figure. Evidently a man of the old type, la vieille roche of Puritanism, a man who, as she said, read on Sunday lonely and rigorous books, and never who had from childhood inspired her with such awe that she never learned to tell time by the clock till she was 15, simply because he had tried to explain it to her when she was a little child, and she had been afraid to tell him that she didn't understand, and also afraid to ask anyone else lest he should hear of it. So that's our Emily Dickinson coming into the little house. And I wanted, of course, to bring her here, and I thought that would be...
It's Higginson, right?
Yes, it's by Thomas Higginson. And also because I'm going to read it after Ruth does her part, from my book called The Lives of a Spirit, which was which was a kind of return to the 19th century, what would be the word, rhetoric, the way people wrote in those days and the way he writes in this message, in order to penetrate whatever veils are left over in us from that time. What language did we abandon and why? But I'm going to introduce Ruth's little moment here from the sort of parts of the introduction to this book called A Wall of Two. For 7 years I was involved in a translation project that finally came to fruition as a book called A Wall of Two, published by the UC Press. After I finished, I went to Weimar to walk across the grass at Buchenwald. Here was where the 2 Polish sisters, Ilona and Henia Carmel, whose poems I translated, lived but didn't die. The fields are marked off as ones where dogs would either not arrive or else died on the way, despite a million cries and prayers. It is, therefore, in the modern sense, sacred. Silence trembles at the edge of sound, like the Aeolian harp laid down on the ground. Here on this site, theological hope is so systematically excluded, it becomes equivalent to mourning. Ilona Carmel was imprisoned inside the Krakow ghetto at age 14, the year I was born. During that October, the Battle of Britain was being fought. It was 1940. Ilona was rushing from street to street as a courier in an increasingly guarded section of her city. In snowy Buffalo, I was eyeing the rooms around me in the lap of a Nazi who was deported back to Germany before I was 1. Ilona and I met in 1978, nearly 40 years later. She died in 2000. From the first day of our meeting until she died, she was my greatest friend. Her sister, Henia, who I never met, became a novelist, as did Ilona, both writing about that terrible time. Henya's children asked me to open up these unattended poems that were in a sort of bag, all untranslated, scrawled Polish. Immediately I understood the meaning of the fear of God when I took on the task of translating poems written in a concentration camp. I had to ask myself questions about appropriation, intrusion, and impossibility. How far had I gone from the original? I would never know. First, because I didn't speak the language, but mostly because the experience was, if you know you're not improving something, then what are you giving it? What is it giving you without having any desire to give you anything at all? The last question can't be answered until long after the give and take has settled its scores, and you have had time to experience yourself as being permanently altered by the activity. So Ruth is going to read a batch of these poems, and it's great that they finally get to breathe outside the walls of the book and away from my cowardice. I think that's it. You're going to say a few things about them too. Yeah.
Well, actually, before I read the poems, I'd like to read a few paragraphs from Fanny's notes on translation, which are in the back of the book. My single goal, to come to the poetry as a poet, that is, to continue the aspiration of Alonia and Henya Carmel, who were writing under intolerable conditions. I took up the task because of my long friendship with Ilona, who was now gone, and because I wanted to make a contribution to the poetry of resistance as it continues through history to this very hour. Enslavement, imprisonment, torture, here they are again. Each translator gave me a small batch of poems to work on. I carried them around with me for many weeks, sometimes months, and treated them the way I treat first drafts of my own work. I scratched and erased and tried again another word or shape over and over until I found the phantom that was rooted inside the words and was ready to walk. I moved some words from one place to another for the sake of sound, because for me, each line in a poem is a sound unit. The difficulty for me was not about interpretation, but about reincarnation. Could I bring these poems back to life in a new body and in a new world? It turned out that the best way to do that was through cutting, and this fact, more than any other, reminded me of the great obligation of translation, to seek the impersonal. The impersonal is the one thing unburdened by attributes, the free one, the one everyone knows in all worlds, the one capable of heroism. So I'm going to read a few poems by Henya, and then the last one by Ilona, who was Fanny's dear friend. Strange poem. This heart has been deaf and dumb for a long time, but today it shouted while the wound burned. In one misunderstood word, the cut opened up yet again, but the throat was struck mute at the larynx. One small, reckless word can throw you down and take you back while the world rolls in on evil clouds. Oh, of course, nothing has really changed. It was just a heart reacting to life for a minute, only to expire again. An answer. How can I act so calm? Strangely, on prison pallets you go quiet. Then days are your sleep, sticky and dreamy. At work you are of a piece with the machines, a screw that turns one way only. This kind of calm feels evil and weak. I've lost any sense of purpose or meaning. I'm calm because I don't care anymore. It doesn't bode well. I have no belief and no desire, no expectations. I'm like a spectator who is not present at her own life, but I know it's escaping me. In the end, I'm just wiped out. That's all. Don't worry. My calm comes from being exhausted and forgotten. It doesn't bode well. To our professors, you taught us to strive for perfection, to live up to the words of prophets and poets, to shun mediocrity. You taught us to seek the truth in certain ideas, taught us to love the magic of language, to express our awe at the universe. You charmed us with stories of heroes, history, myth, until the Holy Revolution, equality, fraternity, danced before our eyes. But with a certain word, humanist, and another, genius, you also ensured our suffering. How? We had no defense against the world in front of us. You should have taught us how to grab life by the throat, to slam it between the eyes until it staggered and fell, to shout so we were heard, to break down the gates, and to get used to the sight of blood. Professors, didn't you ever learn that there is no place on earth for humanists? Why? Why did you plant this dream in us? And then this is the one by Ilona. It's the second half of a poem called Autobiography. Youth. Hush. Close your mouth. Raise your hand into a clenched fist. This is youth. Another story altogether. Bitter and sad. Hard and unavoidable. These memories won't quit. They even hurt. It was the autumn of '39. How to describe? In what language? Fire? That time. When she arrived, she, youth, she without romance or poetic introductions. Distant reader, she came with thunder, soldiers, cannons, machine guns. Youth, no more fables. I see the dark ditch and us in it. Overhead horrible wings, shock, screams, smoke, sun, and a shaking ground. What was the world to us crashed down. Gray petals of smoke unfurled into a red conflagration. From that moment on, it would always be the same. A mother's terror and still her comforting hands. Both of these and that avalanche. Time staggered forward without mercy, carrying each person with him. I grew from 15 to 16. The days were voracious, like creatures that clawed at whatever we took with us, the closest, the most loved. They clawed until they dug a horrible void into our childish faces. We grew old, dull-eyed, dry. Only hate stayed strong. Little but quite sufficient to get us through the graveyard days and give us more bitter knowledge. The art of the closed fist, the clever closed fist. Don't scream from pain, don't express rage. Cut from your lexicon the words happiness, laughter, and change love to hate. Cut all the words that would be a waste. The simple and difficult art of self-censorship is to ensure that no heart exists. Mother's hands, once capable only of arranging flowers in a vase, were now hard. She learned how to deflect a blow with them. Love made them tough while her face grew yellow. Her eyes lost their life until her heart gave up the struggle. So, friend, that is all I can remember. You count. How many graves, how many days, It is now 1945. Blood, a taste of morphine, bad dreams, no more mother's hands. This is the epilogue, friend, from my life inside four walls. I have no childhood dreams, only visitations from the fearful nightmares of those years. Worse for being known, but now with nowhere to run for comfort from them. No maternal hands. The story ends here when I am 20.
You did a beautiful reading. Thank you for that. Just right.
Thank you for doing this.
I think sort of the, I mean, we all have to remember that this has happened right now, but I'm trying to think a lot about, as so many geniuses are, about translation and how many kinds of translation there are, so that even Ruth reading what I'd written is a kind of translation. She read it in a way I couldn't have read it. And so certain little vivid moments come through her voice, not through mine. And also the difficulty of doing it, which I raised in the first little introduction. So I thought what I would do is follow up on the voice of Higginson with reading a short little prose passage out of this book, The Lives of a Spirit, which I wrote many years ago, which is a kind of retreat into the 19th century and trying to find cover in a more beautiful language than the one that we have now. And maybe if you want to, after I read this, we could talk about translation or whatever strikes you. This is like a presentation and then hearing what you have to say about. Is that all right?
Yes.
Yeah. So this, it's called Even This Confined Landscape. One morning around 4, she peeled the skin off an apple beside the warm radiator. On the window pane, etched in frost, were leaves and thorns, silver flowers, and daisy banks. She blew them apart and peeped out at the day. The sky was clear since all the clouds had fallen to earth in cold clumps, which scraping shovels now lifted up. She in her Levi's and sneakers murmured, "Is all this for children? Can I? Mother, if I promise to return home without being forced, can I please take a quick trip? Please, my workplace lies outside these gates. I must build a perfect park. Can I?" The human being is to her parents what an Eden is to a dual nature. You can, but you won't, said my mother, for her own reasons. As soon as your wish can come true, you have already fulfilled it. I personally think the world is 6 hours short of paradise. I ran with a closed Asiatic face. Useless fragments fell off like scales. A cold wave ran under my feet like a bamboo surface as I pedaled across frost maps, round globes of ice, seeking the 5 spiral wheels that enter the gate to God. Structures do variations on the same law. Then comes the alchemist's mind, and all is changed. My shadow seems to be the same shadow wherever I go, and no matter how fast. So what's the excitement? Surprised that the 2 yous are always together? In some unknown month, your skeleton will weigh the same as everyone's. Thick-ribbed ice and chilblain, hot as pepper, will shudder you right down the air to Nova Zembla. During her travels, she carried her bicycle through each park, skillfully, hopping on and off when she turned sharp corners. She could often be found leaning the bike on her inner thigh, surveying with her helmet unstrapped, though still covering her bobbed hair. When snow was imminent, meridian light whitened the pavement. Crosses and branches caught the attention of her quick, bleak eye. Everything was in the way. When she wasn't tossing on her pillow or sitting on the foot of a couch in darkness, she was moving like this around the city parks. Blueprints besieged her as the morning star rose over the crests of the buildings with slow-moving satellites and airplanes. Irregular architecture, mossy in color, was the make of the neighborhood. Some latticed windows and stone porches, slate roofs and chimney stacks. When she rode to each park, followed by the question, can you really build a peaceful place? Her will bent itself double and zoomed. She was fueled by that small question and said yes. From any place she imagined landscaped courtyards, galleries where people could get together and joke, a square for parades, a winter garden, a theater, a church, and a resting place for the military and the solitary. There would be refreshment pavilions, including public toilets for working people and children in an area studded with bowers and awnings. Was it Eden or Jerusalem, a socialist city? Even a communal cemetery was made of plain, unmarked stones under shade trees. And listening in the dawn hours to the radio, it's exactly that dazzling jazz she'd climb up on, the inverse order of tunnels in air. These were the verities of daybreak, a lake of gold with blue clouds building varieties of mountains, the idea of heaven. Like that, the solid black trees seemed to beg and twist to get off this thing. Because of the weather, I could never move far from home. This too is an erotic shaft. Is it a sin or a trigger? It does shoot me up the notes run by run and God burning before. The nursery crib, natural wood slats with colorful decals of bears and balloons, remains my favorite bed. In it I can lie and watch the theater of the weather parade as days. Once I was sitting on a bench making a phalanx out of the chaos of the city. A bench is a kind of crib, after all. And I thought I saw my communard coming. My fingers twisted a bit of costume rosary, a chaplet made of garnet and rhinestone. I swept the masks for one of him, but he'll never find her. Not that one, it was wrong. Exteriors become rutted and dimpled. Depressions finally shade what once was smooth as the plump white back of a duck. She eats fast from the pan with her fingers, but will never be filled. Disappointment becomes the one appointment you can count on. One time the flush left her face. She saw the perfect park, like a field of lighted jack-o'-lanterns under a dawn sky. The tops and hummocks in the cemetery seemed to release orange auras. Peace! Quickly she whispered her insight to heaven and moved away from the place like an independent traveler who's forcing her reluctant body to move through foreign streets. She felt like a face in an illuminated manuscript who couldn't get off the beautiful page about God. Rushing home, she passed the office where the paper green Christmas tree was weighed down with gold bulbs and gold trim, and the women over their machines humming. It reminded her of a green bench with small half-dewdrops littering the paint. That was luxurious thought. If she had paused long enough, she would have thought only of the women themselves, their tedious labor. At home, begonias spat waxen petals pink against the haze in the kitchen. The chimney smoked like a tea kettle. A smell of bacon and toast had burned away the morning, the noon. Let her now pour the tea and pass the little almond cakes with pink icing. She missed the other two meals and menus, and it had started to change again outside. Clouds had congealed into one giant snowflake, whose stellar parts are spread from pole to pole. There is a yellowing around their edges as with burned or old paper. The air champs at cheek and eyelid, and plumes of snow pour from the chimney stacks. She pours the tea and yellow jonquils in a thick glass vase, are splayed against a window where the snow is now shown to be speeding, white on gray. It forms first a thick pocked surface, the same it will return to. The community is moving around, waiting to eat and wash up. From the yellow jonquils comes a jocund melody, clarion and strings. The house is warm, and Sunday would suit its atmosphere of genteel atheism. If I had climbed up among the chimney stacks and the sampler city was spread out before me, I would have looked again for a park where nothing retaliates. There the small birds huddle heads under wings, the ducks waddle and squat like cream puffs around the whitening pond. The water squeaks into knots at surface and settles, and the trees, as still as granite, live for the night. I would have said, "Mother, stay at the window, but don't call me in." So that's it. Thank you. Questions, she said. I don't care about questions or answers. Doesn't matter. You can just hang out.
We can. You know, when we were talking about this, one of the things you mentioned we might talk about is a remembrance of Bill. I'm refusing to have one day to do it. I want to spend this year doing it and hopefully end up with a reading of the Columbus Square book at the end of my season. But, I mean, how did you meet Bill? Because, I mean, to me, as I've been looking back, it's so entwined at this point, and with events in my life that have nothing to do with yours, that you were there. You know, the going away party for you, which, you know, evolved into the Kenward Elmsley evening, which was this wonderful chaos of a disaster. But how'd you meet Bill?
Oh, well, do they want to talk about it?
I don't care. It's a place to start, and then I because we're talking about, I mean,
I met him in a bar. So,
yes,
in Harvard, with a lot of poets around. The one that used to be what Grafton Street is now.
Oh, yeah.
Cronin's.
No, it was two brothers, Greek brothers.
Okay.
Do you remember them?
I remember Bill and Cronin several times. That was just down past the Travelers Lodge on Mount Auburn Street.
Exactly, that's gone now.
Right.
But the place, Grafton Street, used to be.
Bow and arrow.
Bow and arrow,
Yes,
that was
thank
it.
you.
And that's where I met him. There were a bunch of people just hanging out.
when?
Oh, God.
Roughly. Yeah. I mean, if you don't know who I mean, I'm sure there's some people here who don't know who we're talking about or why we're making a fuss about this. We're talking about William Corbett, poet, Boston. He left us and went to New York. We haven't forgiven him for that. But he also had a press and published Fanny's last book, published my book, published your book, on and on and on. And so I think a lot of us have been fumbling of a way to celebrate him, remember him, because we lost him in August. And so that's why I bring it up.
No, I understand. Yeah.
You know,
I just was
Buying the
wondering.
books. Buying the books, they can help it.
well, there's that. I mean, if you're inclined, all press wafer books are currently 75% off at both the site and the press wafer site and at SPD, which means they're probably costing more to ship than they are to buy. It's a little breathtaking. But everything's all tied up with lawyers and you know, tax exemptness and so on and so forth. So that's their solution for all this. But the two of you and
That was 65.
65,
Yeah.
yeah. So back to translation questions. I mean, it's.
I have a translation question. You said, as with the 19th century spirit, used the phrase jocund jonquils,
Yes.
which is absolutely irresistible.
I know.
But
But
when I
it's
hear
too much.
joking, I think of a fat, laughing man. I do not feel that I'm talking about jonquils or a feminine sensitivity. So I wonder how much
It was
permission
irresistible.
you gave yourself to just sound smart.
Well,
rather
I
than-
don't think of the man you're thinking of.
Ah, a very, very fat man with an elven hat.
Don, what's the word you're
dancing
saying?
around.
Jocund.
Jocund.
Spell it.
Jocund, which was an old
Okay.
word,
Yeah.
but I don't think of it
Well, it
as,
goes with John.
it sounds like it, but so would joyous.
No, I hate that one.
There you go. So this is translation, it's personal choice, left and right.
Right. Oh, that's,
Well, we were just, speaking of translation, in many ways, Fanny just introduced Ilya Kaminsky. So, I've been thinking a lot about translation because in a way, first of all, Ilya Kaminsky, his first language is not English. It's Russian, I think Russian.
Russian.
And he, so he wrote a book recently in English, but at the reading, his pronunciation is a little different because he's deaf. And he gave this marvelous reading. So in a way, the whole thing was a translation of a
Yeah, exactly.
you know, and it's just a very beautiful thing that we can try to understand someone else through someone else's language. I mean, many of my favorite poets are not, they don't speak English,
exactly.
and it's a
So-
problem. But, so I don't really have a question, I'm just thinking.
Well, I
out
think
loud
when Ruth read that little part, that the search for the impersonal, that's really at the crux of it. That it doesn't belong to anyone anymore by the time you've done a translation. It doesn't even belong to the time it was translated in. So, I mean, there are translations that everybody now says are too ornate, and Halderlin is a good example of
Yeah.
a poet who's been done over and over again, and some of them are ornate, and some are very pure. And so you will actually never know which is closest to Halderlin. So then you're looking at something else completely, which
Well,
is,
there's the wonderful example of Moncrief translating Proust, and that translation sat there for us in English from 1921, 22 till the 80s, at which time Random House wanted, Terence Kilmartin, I think it was, to retranslate it. And he sat there looking at it, and he said, well, there's problems. Supposedly Moncrief had out-Proust in a lot of the sentences, and they were even longer than Proust, which is quite something. But ultimately, what Kilmartin said was, he said, it's wonderful. And it's this beautiful thing to read in, and it may indeed have nothing to do with Proust in a weird way, but it comes across, it becomes its own entity, I guess is what I'm stumbling towards trying to say. If that's what you mean by the impersonal?
no, I mean even more impersonal. I mean, well, who could I say who already, well, Celan. It's hard to do much with his poems, although there have been several, because he already is impersonal. He already is nobody. Nobody is there. And it's that you aspire to, I think, in translation, is to find the nobody who's there.
You raised so many arguments, but I was thinking about one little point from Benjamin, that the translation should work as a poem in the new language.
Yeah,
It should absolutely work, not as a translation, but now it has to be a poem.
a new poem.
Well, that's
Yeah.
what she says here in
Exactly.
the introduction.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Which is actually what you pushed for in that book,
In
right?
that
Because you
book,
don't
yeah.
speak Polish, so you were
No,
getting
no.
a text from someplace else. Who gave you
But also,
the English to work off of?
The two translators, Warren Niels Lachowski and Ari Gullis.
I think also you're sort of, seem to me to be saying it's also an imperfection. It's you're trying to cut the words of waste, you're trying to do, it's all in the poem
I
as well,
know.
but it's also an imperfection that you can, in many possible translations, and you're gonna pick one that's as close to what you wanna do.
Well, it had to be childish too, because these were two teenagers.
Beautiful.
And so the complexity of trying to be a child and in an unbearable place. I know I didn't get it right in a million parts, but one of the weirdest things was I started moving literal, like I would have, say, the brick wall. I would take the brick out of that and put it down on another line. So in the end, it's just a collage of words that all belong together, but not necessarily in the order
That they were in.
Yeah,
when you-
so
that's
that
interesting.
was just strange.
But isn't being impersonal the most difficult thing in the world? You know, because a lot of poets and people in general come with a lot of ego, and to get away from, you know, you want to say what the poet is trying to say, not what you're trying to say. But how do you know? And isn't it very difficult to become?
Well, the thing is that people are not that mysterious or complicated. I mean, we have a very limited set of characteristics as human beings. So you actually can pretty quickly spot what someone's, as you say, trying to say. And then, I mean, so it's really a matter of kind of almost like a psychic thing. Oh, I recognize you in there. But Ilya said a beautiful thing to me later when we were just together. He said that recognition is one thing, but understanding is better. It's a beautiful thing to say.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When you were dealing with the translations, as a translator myself, you always have to make a decision. Either you're going to put emphasis on the form or on the meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you manage those two?
Well, they were so young that they had read a lot of poetry in school, high school, and they were brilliant girls. So they had a sort of idea of a poem being romantic and dripping with adjectives and everything. But so that there's a whole part of the manuscript that was unmanageably ornate and taken out of a period. Then they became increasingly somber and without extras. But I still, if I saw one of those leftover moments, I would try to break it down somewhere. So that the voice was more important, who was speaking.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm interested in your saying that you were using 19th century language in that prose piece that you read us. I mean, she's in Levi's and there's satellites,
Right.
and so we're now, but it actually didn't sound that much like Higginson to me. So I'm curious.
Well, Higginson was the first thing I did.
No, I understand,
Yeah,
but you
yeah.
said you were using
I was
Higginson-like
dropping back into that era.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I wasn't trying to copy anyone.
No, not copy, but I mean, I thought you said you were trying to use language that was more, no, did I mishear you?
No, you're absolutely right. I was immersed in my childhood and youth in the Brontes and George Eliot, Thomas Hardy.
Right.
And those were my absolute hidden ghosts and gems. So I was trying to get back that, but through the litter of the time we're in. So the Levi's and the bicycle and all of that are still hanging around.
Right, no, I've got
Yeah,
no
I'm sure
problem-
you've got.
I've got
yeah.
no problem with the
Yeah,
juxtaposition between the 20th, 21st century
Right.
stuff, but when you say it's that kind of language, I mean, it seems much more disjunctive to me than that language.
It probably is.
So I'm wondering how it seems 19th century to you.
To me, all the, it just does.
I was wondering, were you kind of thinking maybe like not the way those writers didn't travel that much, and they would dwell like in the sentence and the kind of the, you know, even if you read like Hawthorne or something like the Blaisdell romance or something like that, you know, like there's a lot of world without a lot of, that's completely assimilated. I think being on foot, being in the middle of your experience without moving around a lot really fast, like the way
That's
you're.
true. Every plant is noticed and all of that. This was more on the aspiration of people in the 19th century towards socialism. It is about a utopian vision, and that's throughout the narratives in here. So it's a dream of a utopia.
Of parks and peace.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was the main thing, was aspiration as a kind of fantasy.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's tea and almond cakes
Yes.
and stuff like that, which,
Yeah, exactly, and John was. Yeah.
I have a question. So did what was the woman's name that you translated, this first sister?
Henya.
Henya.
Carmen.
Did she write these poems while she was in captivity? Was
They
she-
wrote them with stolen pencils and
Uh-huh.
bits of paper and sewed them into their skirts.
Uh-huh.
So they had these bundles of poems that they walked around with doing their work and stuck them in. And they had, I still have pictures. Is there one of the pictures? Of a worksheet. They stole worksheets and wrote their poems.
So and then she managed to get them out, and she kept them into her adult life and put them in a little plastic bag.
No, it's much more horrifying than that, the way it all went.
Getting run over.
She was, they were run over by German tanks when they were released out of concentration camps. The Germans were in a fury at them being released, so that they rolled around in tanks. And she had, her leg was crushed forever, and her sister too was, they both were basically killed. She spent months in rehabilitation in Sweden. In all of that, she lost the poems. But someone in line with them, going around being crushed, took them from her, because she'd seen her writing them, grabbed the bag, or the mass of papers, and she escaped. And she went around then carrying these bits of paper for about 2 or 3 years. And then the husband of Henya, who they'd married when they were about 18, came and found her and the papers. And it's an incredible story, unbelievable story, really, of the rescuing of these bits of paper.
They were in a mass grave, so the Germans thought they were all dead. But then some people discovered that she and her sister and her mother were not dead.
Did she see the poems after you translated them?
No, she was dead.
She was already dead.
Yeah, Henya's sister, daughter and son came to me saying, what can we do with this?
Because your relationship with her seems so real to me that I forgot that.
Yeah, I know, it is real.
Yeah.
It's curious, one of the poets I translate is associated with the mass burials in Franco's time, and he was a boy and he witnessed this stuff. So that story needs to be told. Your friends, their story needs to be told. But he was very insistent that poetry was a different emotional and musical address to the situation, which makes it very hard for me as a translator not to be literal, although my instinct is to be literal, but to sense his music. But if I try to sense his emotions, he'll erase that too. The only thing for him in the end is a music that captures his melancholy or nostalgia or his sorrow and grief at what he has seen and the dangers he has experienced.
I can believe it.
So that's an interesting rule. Don't translate the words, don't translate the story, translate the music, and then you still have to define what the original poet meant by music.
Well, I did have my translator read them out loud to me a lot so I could get that sound. But you're right, absolutely.
That's what writing poetry is too.
I think for him, this guy, music sort of meant sonata form or something rather than, a lyric voice.
Yes, yes.
But it's a huge issue anyway. Can I tell more Marty. I do a lot of work with Ceylon, and I think
I
about
know
different
you.
phrases. But I was talking with the renowned Marjorie Perloff about Ceylon and some of his, like, I love his sort of two noun or noun adjective words, Wegbeseit. What does that mean? It actually doesn't mean way bitten or anything, it means corroded. So Marjorie comes back to me and she says, the problem with Ceylon, which everybody thinks of as his genius, is he didn't really know German. And there are large stretches of Austrian German and Romanian German as well as German scattered throughout his work. But what a bitchy commentary.
You're right.
There's a story worth telling, I thought. I don't know.
Well, no, it is, it's fascinating.
Well, it's,
Well, she had just done a big book on Karl Kraus, who knows German. So in comparison, she argued that Ceylon did not actually know German. So everything you think of as an innovation is actually a fault in his fluency.
But maybe that's a good argument for writing out of what we don't know with materials we can't ever.
It's worth
own.
thinking about,
Yes,
yeah, absolutely.
It is.
well, it's very similar in some ways to the whole issue of Pessoa's English poems, which I remember when I was first shown the English poems, I said, geez, it's so obvious this guy don't know English. This is embarrassing. I don't know why the Portuguese like these. And then the guy at the conference at Brown stood up and said, no, what I see here is Pessoa is in love with English. And so when he reads Whitman, he immediately pulls Whitman-esque stuff into the poems and wants to speak English that way. He wants to speak English like Shakespeare. He wants to, and it's like this huge collage of different sounds of English that Pessoa was just enamored of, that he's bringing into the poem in the same way that your jonquils come in, right? The jonquils are in that window for a reason, and that sound of the English comes in for Pessoa. And the guy actually, I mean, in one fell swoop, opened those poems up for me, and that's what that
great.
crew at Brown are doing right now.
That's true, that is what they're doing.
Anybody else?
Hi.
Go.
What physical condition were these papers in when you received them? I mean, did you find yourself having to kind of piece together?
No,
what
somebody, I'd say 1950, typed them up on an old typewriter. So I was getting, some of them were incomplete because they'd all been wet and
Yeah.
torn in this journey. But some of them were totally fine, and they were typed into Polish, of course, not into English. So what I was given was a bundle of typed Polish poems.
And had the sisters, had they revised them or worked on them at all?
Not at
since-
all.
No? So it was entire, you had to sort of be in that
Exactly.
age and that mindset. Did you ever find yourself wanting to kind of correct things or?
Well, I did. I mean, I did try to hone them down to the most vital point of them. So there was, I couldn't correct the Polish, obviously, so whatever I was correcting was English.
Fanny, I'm wondering if you could, hi, how you, it's a long time.
Hi.
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the difficulty of not wanting to read the poems out loud, specifically, if it's just the content, if because it's the translation, right, it's now no longer even, as you've spoken to, the thing which is so difficult. What makes it so difficult, and yeah, just what is that in particular for these poems?
To actually,
Because I also saw you mouthing them.
I know, because I worked so hard on them. I
Right.
mean, they're so close to me, but it was actually the most depressing time. 7 years of raking through all of the memories here and there, and feeling like I was failing all the time. So it was not mine, and especially under the umbrella of that experience. So I've never felt they were mine. At the same time, they have such emotion, and I just can't handle it. And then I would probably start wanting to revise again if I it's like never ending. You never reach the end of them. And I once did try, and then I started crying. I couldn't go. So I didn't want to explain. And Ruth read them so well.
I had a question I was hearing when Ruth read this phrase. It says, "In the end, I'm just wiped out." And that, I thought that phrase "wiped out" struck me because it seemed like it didn't sort of fit into that.
Rather, that,
Exactly.
what's the word?
So
No,
do
I'm not worried.
you make a conscious
Zeitgeist.
decision to use
I
it?
talked a long time with the translator about that one, because it was slang,
Right.
whatever she said.
Right.
It was Polish slang, so I thought, well, what is the way I would say it?
Although that would have meaning before it was a slang phrase, it would be still a meaningful phrase.
That's true,
I felt wiped out.
in every sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah, we
the
spent
ju-
a lot of time on that.
Well, like you said, the juxtaposition of that in this ornate language
I know.
is very interesting.
Well, the worst ones of theirs are definitely the ones that came out of them being high school students that were just, and the poet Julian Tuvin, who was a very, very prominent Polish poet. Do any of you know of him? Anyway, he was the one they worshipped and idolized. And Henya wrote him a letter from the camp just after she got out of the camps.
Do you want to read from the letter?
No, I can't. No. Anyway, they were very aware of other poets in the world, and they were so well brought up, even at age 16 they knew poetry. Yes, a hand up.
I was just going to ask if you had a sense, thinking about the impersonal, if you had a sense of who they were writing to. Or
It says in the letter.
yeah.
You read it,
You won't read it?
What's the letter?
to this poet Julian Tuvin, who is still, none of you have ever heard of him?
Just
No.
from the book.
What?
Just from the book.
Oh,
Let me see there.
what was it that was said?
Is it was he a trans?
No, that was in Polish too. Everything. And that letter was such a amazing thing to discover, stuffed into all those.
So should I just read the last page?
Whatever, yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
So this is from Henia to this poet. We came.
Forgive me, when was this written? What,
Do you
we have
hear
a
this one?
That would have been about
Oh,
40
1947,
Yeah.
that's what it is.
right after.
We came to know that fear can do anything to a human being. We came to know what hunger and slave labor were. The threads linking the point to life kept on snapping and disappearing faster and deeper. But then the poems appeared. They came because they had to, because a person had to have a sanctuary where no one could brutally intrude so as not to be completely alone. You will surmise that one didn't write in comfort at a desk. We wrote them in interminable nights on a sweltering bed of planks, almost unconsciously in a fever. These are those poems, and this is why they are so strange, disordered, chaotic, and deranged with fright. This is why they are so uniform in content, as monotonous as the monotonous gray and hopeless prison days. This is why they resonate with the self-same rhythm. They were dictated by the din of bullets, the crack of gunshots, the growling of machine guns. In the end, this is why they are so poor in words, deprived of beautiful phrases. This is an ordinary primal cry, the rattle of one being choked. I don't ask you, sir, for a gentle appreciation. On the contrary, please be ruthless and honest. Do not be driven by courtesy. These poems were never written with popularity or fame in mind. They are only songs of the damned.
He never wrote back.
Was the letter part of what you translated?
Yes, it was wrapped up in all the poems. It was part of that first manuscript.
Well, was it sent to him? Was it actually?
It was sent to him. And somewhere in a later letter or conversation, she said he never answered.
It's a wonderful bookend here because you start with Dickinson, who got the strange letter in the mail that day, you know, and, but he did respond, bless him.
And I know, bless him, exactly. So.
Are we good?
Well, that was a great place to end.
It
Thank
was.
you all.
Thank you.
Now,
Thanks to Miss Pinto for doing the film
Yes.
back there. Thank you both. It's just a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. There's no time limit. We don't have to be anywhere. Nobody's coming to throw us out. Talk amongst yourselves. You know, there's food. Please hit the bucket if you missed it, and we'll see you next year. Have a grand holiday season. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.